Hello everybody, this is Adam Marsland from Adam Walks Around on the Karma Frog 1 video channel. I am speaking to you from a homestay in northern Bali where I'm on a hiking vacation. The acoustics in here are not the best, so I apologize for the sound quality. I'm already redoing this from a previous inferior attempt, so hopefully it will be okay. I'll show you a little bit of the scenery outside my window, and you might hear some rattling and some motorcycles going by. It's quite a strong wind outside, so again, I apologize for any sound issues you might encounter watching this video. Like, you can probably hear the wind right there. But the mountains of northern Bali are about as far as you can possibly get from the deserts of Southern California. But what we're here to talk about today is the disappearance and subsequent death of Bill Ewasko, which we talked about in episodes 47 and 48 of Adam Walks Around, Ewasko's Last Trail. At that time, I had said that if I subsequently got access to the coroner's or police reports, I would post an update. And about a month ago, Tom Mahood, who most of you know, is the figure behind the years-long crowdsourced effort to find Bill's remains, he let me know that he had finally received the coroner's report from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office. And he gave me permission to talk to you about what was in that report. Now, I'm not going to post the report. I don't have permission to do that, and I'm just not really comfortable doing that. I just feel like Bill's family's been through enough with all our endless speculating, but I do have some responsibility to follow up on this. I will be referencing the report, and I'll be excerpting parts of it, but as far as posting the whole thing, Tom may well do that whenever he gets around to doing his long-awaited wrap-up of the mystery, or someone else might file for it. I'm just not comfortable doing that, so I apologize in advance. For this video, to keep it simple, I'll be doing the basic format I do for my Beach Boys discussion show, Pet Squares. I'm just going to talk extemporaneously off of notes, so it won't be as polished as a voiceover, and if I leave anything out, I'll post a note somewhere up here that you can read it. For those of you that don't want to watch the entire video and just want me to get to the point, did anything that was contained in the report make me rethink the conclusions that I had in Ewasko's Last Trail, episode 48? And the short answer is not really. There was one fairly substantial surprise that opens the door to another possibility. I still think basically the most likely scenario is the one that I outlined in episode 48. I do have a couple of revisions to my thinking about the timeline for that, and a couple of things I want to explain about that. So when we get through with the coroner's report, I will get into that stuff. So let's get right into it. The cause of death, no big surprise, undetermined. There was basically nothing left but bones, and not all of them. Now, when it comes to the stuff that most interests us, there are basically three things that are very, very relevant. And the first one, just to recap, for quite a long time, I rather stupidly did a lot of my theorizing around the idea that Bill did not know where he was. And to just briefly recap the mystery, there's two things that make Bill's disappearance odd. The first is that he was found far north of the area where he was expected to hike. And if he got that far north, it's hard to understand why he just didn't turn around and go back to his car. And the second thing is that although he was quite a ways north, he was in total only about 10 miles from his car. And yet there's a gap of time between when we know his car showed up, sometime Thursday morning or Thursday afternoon, and when his phone went off in an area not far from where his remains were found on Sunday morning. And in between those two areas, there's quite a bit of cell phone reception. So once you put that all together, Bill was confined to a fairly small area for a period of 2.5 days, which is very odd. So that's one reason we thought he might have been lost, and it's another reason we thought he might have been injured. So when we analyzed where he had been found, Tom and I basically reached the same conclusion, that he was navigating up through a wash, up over a hill on the most direct route from where he had come to Park Road, which is the main road through Joshua Tree. And this was a little odd because there's an intersecting wash called Quail Wash across his path of travel, and had he gone either way up Quail Wash, he would have gotten to civilization, and it would have been a much easier path of travel. It would have been flatter, would have been clearer, whereas the way he went straight uphill and and then missed a necessary turn and wound up going up into a wash a little bit out of his way, and then had to climb out of it, and that's where he expired. But we basically came to the conclusion that the only reason he would be up there is if he was dead reckoning a path with the aid of a map. And we went into a lot of detail on episode 48 about the maps, and also the role that I think it played in how he got lost in the first place. So it's a very key question. Did Bill have maps with him when he died? And the coroner's report makes it very clear that yes, he absolutely did have maps. Which maps did he have? He had the map of the park, which we suspected. He had something that was referred to as a trail guide, which implies a book, but it could also be some of the more detailed maps that we discussed, like the Tom Harrison map is encased in plastic. The Nat Geo map, I think, has words like trail guide on it. But for reasons I'll discuss, the nature of the trail guide itself probably isn't that important. But the one thing that they don't talk about finding, which is something that was part of our theory, was a topographical map. However, the coroner's report does mention finding several scraps of paper, including a place where they also found what were said to be hand and foot bones. In fact, the trail guide also found with what they're called hand and foot bones, and also next to what seems to be a lens from a set of glasses. So whatever this piece of paper was, it seems very possible that it was something he was holding. And it also seems very obvious that he had the trail guide out, because it wasn't in the pack. It was found with these bones. So if Bill had a topographical map, which is basically made of paper, and he was holding it when he passed, 12 years went by before his remains were discovered, you would expect it to have disintegrated into scraps of paper in proximity to the bones, and that's exactly what they found. So we don't know that that's what the topographical map was, but basically all the map evidence pretty much lines up the way we expected with this theory. Now, I want to talk a little bit, before I go on to the other things in the coroner's report, about why I say the nature of what I'll call the second map, because there's sort of three levels of maps here. There's the park map, and that has a very low level of detail. And there's a topographical map, which he may or may not have had, which has a very high level of detail. And then the third map, which was kind of in the middle, that would have had a misleading configuration of what roads and trails were and were not shown. What I suggested on episode 48 is that Bill initially got lost because the most obvious path from where his car was parked, which was the Juniper Flats Jeep Trail, was not shown on the contemporaneous maps of the time. It only showed the parallel California riding and hiking trail. So the thinking was, on my part, that Bill left the trailhead thinking that he was on the trail marked on the map, which was actually to the north of the trailhead. And then when he started to make his way back down, he was behind on time, and at that point, he got out a more detailed map, which would reveal to him that there were actually 2 parallel trails, but not realizing that he had come in on the trail that wasn't shown on the map, assumed that he was on the trail that was, and then went looking for the alternate way back, not realizing that it was the road he came in on, since the second trail that was marked on the map was not marked on the ground. There were no signs on the crossroads telling him that this trail was anything important. And then he would have gotten off on another old Jeep trail that intersects, got off on that trail thinking he was going back to his car, and instead it led him off into a bad area. So this fault of the maps, that they didn't show that Jeep trail, is very key to what I think happened to Bill. But there's another dimension to that, in that is where Bill wound up. The same maps of the era, and by that I'm talking about the mid-level maps, the Nat Geo map, the Tom Harrison map, and according to Tom Mahood, a lot of the guidebooks as well, they all showed a network of trails up around where Bill was found that were barely in existence at that time. The Panorama Trail, the Mary Trail, I can't think of the names of the other ones, but I can verify from walking around, these trails existed in little unmarked bits of sections that would appear and disappear at kind of random. If you were a park ranger or a local, then perhaps you could have followed them, but not if you were a hiker from Georgia following a map. Yet all of these maps, while they did not show this very obvious Jeep trail that Bill probably walked in on, they did show a bunch of trails up around the area where Bill was found that weren't really there and didn't really exist until around 2018, when they finally did get around to clearing out these trails a little better and marking them. There was nothing like that at Bill's time. And we know that Bill not only followed this wash up into the mountains when he could have gone around, but that there was a trail marked on these maps roughly following the path that he was going on. And the point where that trail, which was, as you saw in episode 48, barely visible in 2010, at the point where that trail left the wash and would have gone to safety, Bill missed that turn and went further up the wash and eventually had to climb out, and that's when he died. So this flaw of the maps, I think, is, of all the things that I suggested in that episode, this thing about the maps, this is the one I'm the most certain about. My certainty about this has only grown in the intervening months. I really think that whatever happened to Bill, the maps not reflecting what he saw on the ground and the trails on the ground not being marked particularly well are directly connected to why Bill did not make it back to his car. And it's even more certain that Bill chose the path he did up into the mountains rather than going around them because of what he saw on the maps. And part of that probably was because it showed a trail going straight up into this wash and up and over and out, and that would have been his shortest way around, when actually, in terms of the topography, the shortest way for him would have been to go around that area, especially since the trail that he was following kind of wasn't there, okay? So one thing, though, that I want to stress is I do not think this is the fault of the map makers. I don't think this is on them, because this configuration of the maps that was on all of the maps that I've been able to find from around the time Bill disappeared, and that, according to Tom, is also reflected in some of the guidebooks, at least the northern part of this. This was not on the maps that were older, the ones that were kind of made in the 80s and into the 90s. And it's not on the maps that came out in 2017-ish. Those all accurately reflect that there was a Jeep trail and a regular trail coming out of the Juniper Flats trailhead area. 2 trails, not 1. And they do not show the largely non-existent trail network up around the area where Bill's body was found. So why did the maps change and then change back when the roads actually didn't change at all? And the only real change that happened were those trails were actually marked, and this is after all of this map-making mumbo-jumbo occurred. The roads didn't change. The trails didn't change until later. So why did the maps change? So I believe that the map makers were reflecting an administrative directive or influence from Joshua Tree National Park. And the reason I think that this is the case is in the years prior to Bill's disappearance, I was doing a lot of off-roading in California with a friend of mine. We had four-wheel drive, and so we would go on a lot of Jeep trails. And then at a certain point, I believe it was called the Desert Wilderness Protection Act. I don't remember the name of it, and I don't remember the exact year it was passed. What I can tell you is after this legislation was passed, there was a concerted effort in public lands in Southern and Central California to basically erase the old Jeep trails that existed prior to the act and prior to the Park Services taking over the public lands. And this wasn't just blocking off the roads so that you could drive them. They would actively take scrub brush and put it all over the entry point to these Jeep trails, to the point where it was difficult to tell that there had ever been a road there. It was like trying to erase its existence by putting all this random desert stuff there. And even if you wanted to walk on these old Jeep trails, you had to negotiate all this weird scrub brush to get back to where the road was and walk on it. And they did this all over the place. So what I think happened in Joshua Tree was something similar, where the Park Service wanted to de-emphasize the Jeep trails that predated the park, that were put in for mining activity and all the sort of bad things that the land was used for, unless it happened to be part of an exhibit or an existing road they were already using. And they wanted to emphasize their own trail system even when it wasn't really there. And I think this is why the only parts of the Juniper Flats Road that are marked on the maps of the time and on the park map, the official map, are the parts that coincide with the Stubby Springs Loop. In other words, they used parts of the Juniper Flats Road to make their Stubby Springs Loop, which was the official trail. So those parts of the road are on the maps, but the parts of the road that are a road and extremely obvious from the ground are not there. Likewise, all of these trails up in the northern area between Quail Wash and Park Road, the Mary Trail, the Panorama Trail, I can't remember the names of the other ones off the top of my head, but the trails near which Bill was found, they were barely there. And they really had no business being on a map, but all these maps at the same time showed these trails as being there. And then I think there was a realization that there was a problem, and those trails were removed, and the old Jeep trails were reinstated. I suspect, based on little clues, little hints in the research, that the Park Service knew they had a problem, that they sort of backtracked on this influencing policy, what unofficial though it probably was, did certain things to make the trails a little safer, like put up new signs, and at the place where Bill is most likely to have gotten lost, it looks like there are some newly placed boulders to mark the trail that appear on the aerial photographs a year after Bill's disappearance. So I really think that the screwed up map making that did not reflect what was on the ground, coupled with the trails being poorly marked, or in some cases not there at all, played a direct role in both how Bill got lost and why he didn't make it out. And I don't think this is on the map makers. I don't think you should blame them. I think if it's on anybody, it's on the Park Service, who I think in a very well-meaning way, we're trying to influence the maps to where they wanted the public image of the park to go, to the new trails, to the improved trails, not to the bad old Jeep trails of yesteryear. And I think inadvertently contributed to what happened here, and probably to a number of other cases around the same time. To be fair to the Park Service, I have no direct evidence of this other than what I just told you, and I'm sure they did not intend for any outcome like this to happen. But that trend, if you will, of erasing the old Jeep trails, not just blocking them off, but trying to pretend that they weren't there ever, was certainly happening with the Bureau of Land Management around that time. And facts are facts. All the maps around that time had this crazy configuration. Maps before and after didn't. And that's when Bill went into the park on a fairly obvious trail with a fairly obvious way back to his car and didn't take it. It's really inexplicable. I think the most likely thing is this screwed him up. So the biggest surprise on the coroner's report, you remember when I made Ewasko's last trail, I made a big deal about hiking poles or anything like a stick or anything like that not being found at the scene. And a number of people misunderstood the significance of this. They said things like, well, we never use hiking poles. It doesn't stand to reason that he would have. And I know, I don't always use them either. And we were told actually that Bill didn't use them. But why this is significant is the path Bill took, which is straight up this wash. And again, when he could have gone around, but he went straight up on the shortest way back to the car. Then he had to climb up a number of dry waterfalls, at least one of which was pretty substantial, about 6 feet high. And then at the end, he went straight up a pretty steep embankment, a couple hundred meters before he expired. Could he have made that without hiking poles? Yeah, absolutely, but not if he was injured. And that's the key thing, because remember, there's two and a half days of lost time, and he's stuck in a very small area. But that small area is pretty rough terrain. So if Bill's messing around with no hiking poles, and he's trying to, for whatever reason, let's say he got an earlier start than I think he did, and then he has some extra time, like, well, before I go to Quail Mountain, I'll take a little jog north. He messes around up there, and then he breaks something, and then he's stuck there till he can limp out. Okay, that was what we thought happened for a long time. But the thing is, this route suggests somebody that wasn't injured because of the difficulty of it. And I'm prepared to say that if he didn't have hiking poles, it didn't happen. And there's no way Bill was injured. And nobody reporting seeing hiking poles at the site. What was found at the site? Hiking poles. This was a big shock. We were told he didn't use hiking poles, but yet, according to the police report, there were 2 hiking poles found at the site. Now, before I get into this, I will say that on the original park report, there was a picture of something that looked like a hiking pole, but it looked too flimsy to really be one, and I showed it to a couple of other people, and I was told that that was the tubing for the camelback, the water bladder that Bill was carrying. And I considered the possibility that these really weren't hiking poles, but these were these bladders and that were misidentified as hiking poles. So I went through the report, but it appears that the police did find actually the things that go to the camelback also, and the camelback was found fairly far from the hiking poles. They provided GPS coordinates for all of the bits of the remains. It was very useful, and we'll talk a little bit about the significance of them as we go along. So it looks like these were really hiking poles. So Bill had hiking poles. If Bill had hiking poles, theoretically, even if he had an injury like a broken ankle or I suppose it could have been a soft tissue injury bad enough to slow him down that much. That's a possibility too. Could he have made it here? Can't rule it out. Can't rule it out. It would have been tough, but I think it's possible. But that gets us to the main event of the coroner's report, which is what was the condition of the bones? Were there any fractures on the bones? And I will quote what it says. Antemortem and perimortem trauma are not identified. In other words, no broken bones. But this is the thing. If Bill was stuck in a small area for a long period of time, it wasn't a broken arm, it wasn't a broken wrist, it probably wasn't a concussion, maybe, but it was most likely a leg injury or just possibly a hip injury. They recovered all of the leg assembly bones except one, the right fibula. And if you were expecting Bill to break something hiking, That's exactly the bone you would expect him to break. Here in Bali 4 years ago, when I broke my ankle, that's what I broke, right fibula. It's the small bone that runs behind the leg bone, run up your ankle. So if you put too much pressure on that leg, on the foreleg, that's the smallest bone, that's what's going to snap. So if you don't have the right fibula, you're missing the sort of the main bone we want to look at. You know, I mean, it is useful to know that the left fibula is still there in the leg bones. He didn't break his leg, didn't break his left ankle, but the right ankle's the most likely place for him to have an injury, and it's not there. This does open the door to a scenario where, which I believe, I don't want to speak for him, but I believe this is what Tom still thinks most likely happened, is that Bill, for whatever reason, decided to move north from Quail Mountain, and again, because of the patterns of cell phone coverage, he would have had to have gone quite far. He would have had to have gone almost all the way to Smithwater Canyon, because if he'd been injured just going over the hill from Quail Mountain, he should have been able to get a call out long before Sunday. It's conceivable that Bill snapped his ankle, was delayed by the process of getting down from rough terrain with an injured ankle, maybe having to wait for a while to let the pain subside, and maneuvering around on these sort of now crutches, these two poles, and got up to, and then it took him 2.5 days to get where he wound up. So that is a plausible theory based on finding the hiking poles. Do I think that's what happened? No, I don't. Tom and I disagree on what is and isn't likely with respect. You know, I mean, and I think we've benefited both from sharing information, and I've definitely strengthened my thinking by having him try to pick holes in what I've had to say. But there's a number of reasons why I don't think this is likely. One is that the poles, if Bill had hiking poles, it makes the injury itself a lot less likely to happen. Not impossible, because the terrain's still pretty bad and you can still make a wrong move and, you know, you're down. So I'm not saying that it rules it out, but it's a lot less likely that Bill sustains a serious injury if he's got 2 hiking poles. So that's one thing. The second thing is, and again, now I'm speculating based on what I would do, and that's always dangerous, but when Bill went up into the last wash that he went up into, he had an easier way out. He could have gone around that whole deal via Quail Wash and hiked out that way. And he didn't do that. And he obviously didn't do that because he saw a more direct route. The map's topography implied that it was going to be faster, and the maps probably showed there being a trail up that wash as well. So he chose the more difficult route up into the hills. But if he was actually walking around with 2 poles and a broken ankle, I have a hard time believing he wouldn't have taken the longer, easier way out, because that was, you know, it's one thing to kind of go down, or in level terrain when you got a messed up ankle, it's another thing to go up. You know, that is going to be hard. Is it possible? Sure. I think, you know, he obviously was extremely determined and just very focused on getting out. And if anyone could have done it, I think Bill Ewasko could have done it. But this is the third thing I wanted to say, is like looking at his path up and the path he took, it really looks like somebody that was not concerned with physical obstacles. He had the full use of his body. There's no sign that he kind of went, oh, well, here's this dry waterfalls. Crap, well, I'll try to climb out of the wash here. And I mean, in a way, I mean, I took you up that path in episode 47, and I've been up it, and Tom's been up it, and Rick Capuccio is another guy that's really into the case, has been up it. I would love it if everybody that was interested in the case retraced Bill's last steps up that wash, and if they got the same impression I did, that this was not an injured guy's path. That's a subjective impression on my part. So I'd genuinely be curious to know how everyone else thought about it if you took the same hike that I did. And the last reason I don't think this is what happened is just the same reasons that I said in episode 48. It just doesn't make sense for Bill to abandon the ascent of quail, which is something that we knew that he wanted to do, or at least it was in his itinerary, to take a run up Smithwater Canyon when he didn't have time. He could have easily gone there on another day without breaking a sweat because he could have come in from the north. And it just doesn't really track to me. But all that being said, Tom Mahood is the guy. I'm number 2, okay? And a distant 2. He's got the most time in this case. He's got the most knowledge of the terrain. He's a much more experienced hiker than I am. He's so if this is what he thinks happened, we have to pay attention to that. My personal opinion is I think it's more likely Bill got lost on Stubby Springs Loop and frittered away a couple of days trying to find rescue up in Covington Flats. But we can't rule out this other scenario where Bill, for whatever reason, goes north from Quail, injures himself with the poles, and then it takes him 2.5 days to get to where he was found because he's limping and walking on poles. Can't rule it out. So that's an alternate scenario that is not disproven by the evidence at the site. However, it must be said, there is no evidence on the site that he was injured, just that some of the things that we would need to feel more confident that he wasn't injured are not there at the site. Other significant things in the report. One thing I want to cover real quick is the report says a couple of times that Bill told his fiance that he was planning to hike Quail Mountain. I'm pretty sure this is some hearsay motivated retconning on the part of the sheriff's department just to make the report a little easier and just make everything look tidy. I'm pretty sure this is incorrect. If they had known Quail Mountain was Bill's destination in the first place, I'm sure that Bill's car would have been found long before it was. But I do want to bring up that they did say that. Another thing that I think is interesting about the placement of all of the stuff that they found, obviously there was animal activity that scattered Bill's remains in several areas, but there's a couple of things that are really clear from what they found. One is, as I said, Bill had the maps out, which dovetails with everything that we believe about what he was doing in his last minutes. He knew exactly where he was. And more to that fact, even though we can assume everything else was moved, assuming these are really poles, they appear to have been found up against the rock wall. And if that's the case, that means that Bill went up to the rock wall, looked out over it, saw where he was, probably saw he was a mile from rescue, and sadly just laid down to rest thinking, it was over. He was just a little more way to go out. And whatever overtook him, my personal opinion is I would look pretty hard at a heart event, because he just really exerted himself in a way that I don't think he did up to that point, going up that hill. That must have taken a lot out of him. But to me, my opinion, if Bill died from some sort of slow-moving death, like dehydration, heat stroke I know less about, but I would expect to find him sort of crawling between the point where he was found and the road. He was so close. And because the poles are up against the rocks, but his remains are a little bit back from the rocks, it seems like he got up to the stones, looked out, it's like, okay, I'm there. And then he went to rest or something. And then he never moved again. And the other thing is the maps were out. They weren't in the pack. He had the maps out. So I feel like this was most likely a heart thing. Too much stress going up that hill, contributing factors of dehydration and heat, and just something overtakes it. But again, I'm not a doctor. And actually, if you are a doctor and you want to weigh in on this, I would love to hear your opinion on it. We'll never know So I'm just trying to squeeze the last bit of juice out of the evidence that we've got. But anyway, it looks like Bill saw where he was, knew he was almost out, and then went and laid down and passed away, unfortunately. Some other things at the scene, no camera found. That's a surprise. And it's unfortunate because if he had taken pictures on the way, we would have some clues as to his route, and that would tell us what happened to him. The 2 water bottles that we think he left the car with, they were found at the scene. That's another potential clue gone because there's so few things out in the backcountry that, let's say, if Bill did what I think he did and he went up Covington Wash, you might just barely be able to find a bottle and tentatively tie it back to Bill. Maybe if you found it next to a place he might have slept for a couple hours. That would be some corroboration that he took this other route. But all the bottles are accounted for, so that's not going to happen. Another thing we're not going to get, now oddly the inventory does not say that they found a phone, but the people that found Bill's remains did find a phone. They described it as being something similar to a BlackBerry with something that had a hinge and a separate keyboard. But as far as we know, no unsent texts that could tell us what Bill was thinking, where he was, what happened. I don't know if they ever checked for them. And I suppose it's possible that when it's returned to Bill's family, they might be able to figure that out. And, and they have no obligation to share that with us if they do find out. And I can understand why they wouldn't. But there's no indication that such texts exist. If they do, we're unlikely to ever find out about them. Other things found in the pack. Let me find this. I should have had it up. Here we are. Backpack contained eyeglasses and case, which is interesting because remember there was a glasses lens found with what was probably a hand bone and the trail guide, which if he already had glasses in the case in his pack, what were the other set of glasses? I don't know. Reading glasses? I don't know what that would have been. Could have been sunglasses, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, key ring with vehicle rental tag, wallet and contents, emergency whistle, spoon, and a Camelback water bladder. And again, below it says that they found a Camelback hose, and so that is distinct, I guess, from the what are supposedly hiking poles. So that's it. And I think that's probably all we're ever going to know in terms of the evidence. Unless the fibula is found intact or no. I can't think of any other piece of evidence that would give us any kind of clue as to what happened to Bill Ewasko. So with all that, I want to circle back to the theory that I advanced in Adam Walks Around, episode 48. I'm going to get a glass of water, and then I'm going to tell you about those and what I think might be some refinements to the theory.